you're obviously here, presumably because you want the UK to stay in the EU.
Definitely.
You're here because you want the UK to stay in the EU?
Yes.
Okay.
I do want a second referendum. I do want the UK to stay in the EU, but I also think that the reason, as you know, the reason why so many people voted against staying in the EU in the first referendum is they didn't know what they were voting for.
So what do you say to the argument that with the EU, the European demos cannot remove the EU kratos, and therefore the EU isn't actually democratic?
I would agree that the EU is not very democratic. It tries to be, in that it tries to have all its people in Brussels elected, but at the same time it isn't.
And what do you say to the argument that because in a democracy people have to vote in or out the governing powers, and with the EU we can't do that, so the EU isn't democratic? What do you say to that argument? The executive power at the EU level, we can't vote that in and out like we can do in our national countries. What would you say to that argument?
Well, the argument is, therefore, to stay in the EU and campaign for that. I think there is a reasonable argument saying there's a democratic deficit in the EU, but you don't solve that problem. You don't solve the problems of Europe by running away. You stay in and you fight the cause. And I think over a course of time, Europe would become increasingly democratic and become the kind of Europe, really the Europe that we want.
If you mean the European Commission, they are the civil servants. We don't vote for the civil servants in our own country either.
Right.
The EU is actually governed by the Council of Ministers and the Parliament, so it is governed by our representatives.
How do the people of Europe change the political direction of the EU?
By arguing and making our case within the EU and getting a sufficient number of governments to agree that is necessary.
And do you think the euro is a good thing? Do you think the UK should join it, or do you think it's been a good thing for countries like Greece and the rest of southern Europe?
The jury's out on that one, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, okay. So you wouldn't support the UK joining the euro?
Well, not immediately.
Yeah, I would. I think it would be much easier. I can't see any reason not to.
Personally, I've always thought we ought to have joined the euro in the first place. I think that the currency would be stronger if everybody's part of it.
Hasn't it been bad for Greece and southern Europe?
I have less commitment immediately to the euro, but I think in the course of time a common currency does make sense. But I do think it's got to be managed in such a way that it doesn't make the lives of particularly the poorer countries that much worse.
We're a net contributor to the EU, and therefore financially, in terms of grants for whatever it is, we don't actually get any money from the EU because we're net contributors.
I don't believe we are a net contributor completely, no. I think, yes, we are a net contributor in terms of what we get back from the EU officially, not what we get back from the EU in terms of some of the grants.
Growth in GDP since we joined the EEC has slowed continuously since we joined the EEC.
No, I don't believe that.
You don't believe it? Okay. Do you think we economically have benefited from being members of the EEA and the EU, or do you think it's not made much of a difference either way?
I think we've benefited enormously since we've been part of the EU.
I mean, were you aware that since we joined the EEC that our rate of economic growth has slowed and hasn't increased?
Yeah, but everything's based upon money, and I don't think money is necessarily the basis upon which we should do everything.
Say there's another referendum and we vote to remain in the EU by a similar amount, so 52% to remain on a similar turnout. How's that going to resolve the issue? You've then got two referendums with a similar turnout and a similar result, one going one way, one going the other. Isn't that going to cause more division and more uncertainty and more disruption to this country?
I mean, to some degree I agree with you that we live in a very much a divided society at the moment, and I don't think that's going to be an easy option. I think it will be difficult. But from my point of view, I think in a second referendum, people will have the chance to know what they're voting for.
Why would the second referendum be valid and the first referendum not valid?
Because it's later. Because it's based upon the facts that we know now that we never knew at the time of the first referendum, which to a great extent we were told quite a lot of things that were pure fantasy.
Were we not sold an economic fantasy that we would go straight into economic recession if we voted to leave, though?
Oh, we were told lots of things, and quite honestly, that was more about people wanting to win power.
And doesn't that incentivize the EU to offer us a bad deal so that, well, if the choice is remaining in the EU or a deal that's completely rubbish, then that's fixing the second referendum, isn't it?
Well, I think that we do know a lot more now because there's been 28 months of negotiations and discussion and so on. I mean, the country's a lot better informed now.
We can decide as a nation whether to join the EU and also whether to come out.
Yes.
If we stay in, we always have the option to come out if we regret it.
Right.
If we leave, we will not have the option to get back in. And therefore, it seems to me a no-brainer that we should prefer to stay in until a large majority of the people are determined to come out.